Hey, let's do something stupid. Let's make a position player a two-way player. So recently, Yadier Molina and Albert Pujols made their pitching debuts, and while position players pitching have become more commonplace, although not so much for people probably headed to the Hall of Fame, pitching in games your team is winning is still relatively new for position players, as Jay Jaffe pointed out in this article. But that got me thinking, what if you turned your run-of-the-mill bench player into a two-way player? There is a reason why I think teams would want to do this, which I'll argue for in a minute, but first let me explain what a two-way player is and the requirements to get them. So if you're familiar with baseball, you probably know who Shohei Ohtani is. After all, he is the most searched player ever. One thing you might not know is how he gets the two-way designation in the first place. It's pretty simple. While position players can take the mound if their team is winning or losing by 6 or more runs, they can't if the game is any closer. If the game is any closer, the person on the mound has to be a pitcher or a two-way player. To get that designation, they need to play 20 games in the field or at DH and get 3 at-bats per game, while also getting 20 innings pitched in a season. For a player like Shohei Ohtani, that's pretty easy. Ohtani is a starter. All he needs to do is start roughly 4 games on the mound and play 20 games at DH, and he can do that in a month. Other players, not so much. In fact, unless you're Michael Lorenzen, Ohtani's own teammate by the way, and you're a starter, you're almost certainly not skilled enough to play 20 games in the field and get 3 at-bats a game. Lorenzen himself might not be that good, although he has played 34 games in his career in the outfield. As for relievers, there are 2 players who came up in the majors right now as position players who are pitching. Javi Guerra, nope, not that one. This one, and Anthony Goss. Theoretically, they could be our two-way players of the future, but they both failed as hitters, and Guerra isn't doing so hot as a pitcher either. Which leads me to this proposal. We need to make a random bench player a two-way player, and this two-way player doesn't even need to be good at pitching. They could literally be Albert Pujols. There is one big reason why I think a team should try this. In the major leagues, you're capped on how many pitchers you can have. So while converting your backup shortstop into a two-way player won't give you the ability to get a 14th pitcher, it will allow you to save your bullpen, and it gives you a potential opening in games that are tighter than 5 runs. A few years ago, while this rule was put on pause, the Braves put Charlie Culberson on the mound in a 3-run game against the Nationals. Why? Because they were in the second game of a doubleheader, and manager Brian Snitker didn't want to reuse arms that he'd used in the first game. Was this the best decision? Oh, definitely not. But converting your backup infielder to a two-way player gives you the flexibility to do that. Culberson, by the way, has a 1.69 ERA in 5.1 innings. The real question is, can you do it? Are there enough blowouts in a season to get your bench player to a two-way status? For this, I'm going to look at 2 players, one on a good team and one on a not-so-good team. Before I do that, I do want to note an honorable mention. When Jared Walsh, the Angels all-star first baseman, came up in 2019, he actually came up as a two-way player, and his stuff wasn't bad. As a lefty, he maxed out in the low 90s and had breaking pitches in the 70s. He also struck out 21% of batters he faced and had a 1.80 ERA. That's pretty good. Just don't look at his walk rate. So why not turn him into a two-way player? One is that the Angels just don't want to, and he's a starter. He's not what we're looking for. We're looking for bench players. He's an all-star, and bench players don't make the all-star game. The first player we'll look at is Charlie Culberson. Culberson now plays for the Rangers, and his hitting is not so great, but he could be immensely more valuable if he was also the worst reliever on the team. Last season, the Rangers were 60-102, one of the worst teams in the league. Did they have at least 20 games that were decided by more than 6 runs? If they did, and a position player were to pitch in every game that happened, they would have enough innings to be a two-way player. So, the answer? It's yes, they did. They had a record of 6-17 in games with margins of greater or equal to 6 runs. Congratulations, bad Rangers team. You could have had a position player pitch enough innings to be a two-way player. But you might be asking, hey Lefty, why would a bad team even bother trying to save arms for the playoffs? They're bad. They're not making the playoffs. And you'd be right. So let's look at a good team. This year's Giants have already used Luis Gonzalez, nope, wrong one again, as a pitcher 3 times. The Giants aren't as good as they were last season, but they are still a fine team. Looking at last year's game logs, however, did they play enough blowout games to make Luis Gonzalez a two-way player? The answer is yes again. In fact, they played more blowout games than the Rangers, and they won 19 of the 26 games considered blowouts. But wait, what if the position players allowed too many runs? That's a fair question. After all, you aren't saving the pen if you're blowing the game. Let's look at the average ERA for position players. So far in 2022, we aren't looking so hot. Position players have had a 16.93 ERA. If this player was in your bullpen, you'd want nothing to do with him. But wait, a 16.93 ERA. If you don't know how ERA works, it calculates how many runs a pitcher allows per 9 innings. All we need is for this position player to pitch 1 inning per game. So if we do the math, we'd find that they're allowing fewer than 2 runs per inning. And if all they need to do when they're on the mound when their team is winning is protect a 6-run lead, they could theoretically do that. It's a win-win. Fans get the joy of watching some random bench player lob 65-mile-an-hour fastballs, while managers get to reserve their best arms for higher leverage. Sounds cool, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to see Brett Phillips get 20 games on the mound. Well, here's where I argue against my own argument. In order to qualify for a two-way player, it would most likely take the player until late August to get the designation, and that's if they're pitching every single mop-up game, even if those games are a day apart. It'd simply take way too long to make the designation worth it, and if they don't hit the benchmark the following season, they lose the status anyway. And once they get the designation, they can pitch earlier. Look, if I was in charge, this would be fun, but there's a reason I'm not a major league manager.